Welcome to Fear Street.
Yesterday, me and my 3 brothers went on a short, one-night camping trip to the lava tubes near Fillmore, Utah. It was pretty much in the middle of nowhere, in the desert. We had a good evening hanging out and talking before watching the stars, a movie, and going to bed. We brought a 4-man tent and set up our campsite far from the dirt road, even though we were the only people there. My brothers all fell asleep pretty fast, though for some reason I couldn't, so I just listened to the coyotes howling in the distance for about an hour and a half. By now it's about 12:30 or 1 a.m. and I'm still awake. Suddenly, I get this odd feeling, like the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and my gut sank at the same time. That's when I hear it. Someone or something was walking toward our campsite. At first, I thought it was just a coyote, but it sounded heavy, and its footsteps sounded like it was bipedal. I could hear its feet sliding through the grass and shifting the stones on the ground as it was getting closer and closer to us, until the footsteps sounded like it was right beside our tent. But I couldn't see it from where I was. Suddenly, I heard a shrill, hollow, unearthly whistle coming from just outside the tent. I went stiff. My heart was racing. It sounded so unnatural and alien that I didn't know how to react. I was just terrified. Finally, after a long minute of silence, I heard it slowly walk away, the same heavy footsteps, until I couldn't hear it anymore. I was more scared than I've ever been in my life last night. I was too scared to even peek outside the tent, but now I kind of wish I had. I stayed awake for another hour, wondering if I should wake my brothers or not. But I decided against it and tried to sleep. This morning, before we packed up and left, I told them what I had heard, but none of them believed me until we made it back home and my dad told us something really unsettling. He said that last night, around 12:30, he felt super worried about us and he didn't know why. He told us that he had this feeling like we were in severe danger and that he needed to pray for our protection, which he did immediately. Once my brothers heard him say that, they took my story a little more seriously, but they're still skeptical, as am I. I don't know what I heard last night, but I do know that I heard something. My name is Eli, and I'm 22 years old now. I've always loved being outdoors and in the woods. I remember about 9 years ago, when I was around 12 or 13. My family and I moved to Minnesota to help out my grandparents. They were getting up there in age and couldn't run the farm like they used to, and also just for a change of scenery. A year or so after the move, my 2 brothers and I got into the habit of running around the edge of the woods, along the backsides of the property, and exploring where we probably shouldn't. One day after school, my brothers and I got our stuff and made about a 500-yard walk to the forest behind the house. My brothers decided to take off and run ahead, about another 300 yards ahead of me. They were wrestling and just being rambunctious teens. I noticed a bundle of flowers that my grandmother would have loved. As I was looking at the flowers, I heard a bit of rustling in the woods, about 15 or 20 feet to my right. I didn't think much about it because, it's the woods, so I shook my head and went to grab the bunch of flowers to give to my grandmother. No sooner than I reached my hand out to grab them, I heard, in my brother's voice, someone call my name for help. It sounded just like my little brother, except it was off a little bit, like it was being played by a recording. I immediately froze because, as I looked up, I noticed my two brothers were a ways ahead of me, playing in the snow. I remember calling for them to hurry up and come with me to the house. And as I turned to run up to the house, I noticed a lone coyote moving in between some old beat-up trucks that my grandfather had parked in a pasture on the edge of the woods. But this coyote was considerably larger than anyone I've seen up until this point. But what struck me as odd was that this coyote looked like it had been hit by a car, and I swear, as it moved around, it looked like it had its paws on the side of the truck, like it was trying to look over the truck at me. I couldn't help myself and yelled, "Hey!" to it, and we sat for about a minute or so, just staring at each other. Before I could turn and start walking back to my house, I watched this thing lean around the truck and say in my brother's voice again, "Hey!" When this happened, I yelled for my brothers and booked it to the porch of the house. As my brothers caught up to me, they noticed how pale I was and asked what was wrong. So I told them I'd seen a mountain lion, scared of being ridiculed for seeing something so ridiculously frightening. Later that night, I was looking around on the internet and found some other encounters by people all over the United States. They'd had similar stories, and I came across an article about skinwalkers, which was both terrifying and interesting. This isn't the only encounter I've had with such entities. I just wanted to get my story out there as a bit of a warning that there are things out there that don't really make sense to the human mind. This is part 2 of my story. My name is Eli. I'm 22 years old, and I'm still a pretty avid outdoorsman, despite the events that have plagued me in the past. The events in this encounter happened not too far outside Ocala National Forest in Central Florida. So the day started with a phone call from my brother, who was asking to take a hike in the National Forest outside of our town, and then to spend the night out there in hopes of doing a little fishing and roasting some marshmallows over a fire. It was me, my brother, and his girlfriend, so it was going to just be a chill night. We left town and headed to the woods pretty early that day, around 3 in the afternoon. We'd gotten to our spot in the woods after 2 hours of riding around, trying to find the perfect spot to set a tent. My brother, sister, and I decided to start the day with some fishing, so we grabbed our rods and a tackle box and headed for a little stream about a quarter mile from our camping spot. As we came close to the stream, we noticed an awful smell, like rotten meat. When we came up to the river, we found the source of the smell, an abundance of dead fish all around the edge of the stream, and we saw that the water had a nasty rust-colored tint to it. When we were done gagging at the sight and smell of what was in front of us, A huge sense of dread washed over us, with an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. My sister noticed and asked what was wrong, so I played it off with a joke and suggested we go make the fire and set up the tent, not wanting to frighten her. After another 30-minute hike from the stream back to the campground, my brother and sister started collecting wood for the fire, while I started to set up the tent. I finished around the same time they came back, so we got the fire lit and decided to start roasting some marshmallows. Before I could eat any, I had to pee, so I told them I was going to step into the woods for a second. I walked about 30 feet into the woods and started to relieve myself, when suddenly I heard my sister say, "Hello." Finding this extremely odd, I looked around and didn't see anyone or anything, so I went back to my business. As I was zipping up my zipper, I heard her say again, "Hey." Thinking they were pranking me, I rushed back to the campground to find them still roasting marshmallows over the fire. Kind of freaked out, I asked them if they had been messing with me, to which they frowned and explained that they'd been in the same spot since I went into the woods. Now terrified, they saw how ghost white I turned and asked me if everything was all right. I told them what I'd heard, and they suggested we just go into the tent and go to bed early, so that's what we did. After already taking a while to fall asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of underbrush crunching right outside of our tent. The horrible smell from earlier also returned, worse than before. For fear of scaring the hell out of my brother and sister, I decided not to wake them up. I just sat there, shaking and sweating. I noticed the sound of twigs snapping had stopped, and I began to hear loud, raspy, and heavy breathing, like something was trying to sniff out our tent. I quietly tried to lay back down and cover my ears so I couldn't hear the breathing anymore, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, we woke up late, so we decided to start packing up our belongings and head home. When we got out of the tent, the first thing we noticed was that our cooler had been torn up and thrown upside down against a tree, with everything that was in it strewn throughout the campsite. Another thing I noticed when I was rolling up the tent was there were a ton of footprints, weird footprints that almost looked like normal, except for obvious claw marks above each toe. Once I spotted these, I hurried up with putting the tent in my truck and got my brother, sister, and myself out of there as quickly as I could. As of yet, I haven't been back camping in any kind of woods, and I can't imagine coming across another one of these things. A few years ago, the girl I was dating at the time invited me to go with her family to their grandmother's house for Christmas. This being the first time I've ever been to a Native American reservation, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had a lot of ideas regarding what it might be like, as well as the what-ifs. Nevertheless, excited to go somewhere I'd never been before, I agreed. Most of my excitement was reserved towards learning more about the culture and the unique opportunity of visiting a reservation as an outsider. Because of this, I was also a bit nervous. What if I wasn't accepted? Would the people be welcoming, or would they be hostile towards my presence? Although these questions were lingering, most of my fears were quelled by the wonderful hospitality I was shown by both her grandmother and the people I had the privilege to interact with while visiting. We left our house on Christmas Eve with our dog and began the 4-hour journey to Grandma's house. On the way, we saw the most beautiful sunset over the mountains. After traveling for about 3 hours, we found ourselves at the turnoff that led to an hour-long drive on a desolate road that would eventually take us to our destination. While on this road, my significant other shared stories of dances and the polytheistic practices their tribe had. All of this fascinated me and left me asking even more questions. By the time we arrived at her grandma's house, it was dark and cold out. I began unpacking the car while my significant other took our dog a bit away from the house to do his business. By the time they got back, I had taken our bags inside and locked the car up for the night. As we sat around the table eating, we shared stories and played a card game. After about an hour, we all said goodnight to one another and got ready to turn in for bed. At midnight, my girlfriend and I laid down and called our dog to the bed. A short time thereafter, we fell asleep. I had forgotten to turn the light off that was next to the bed on the nightstand. At around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up, having to use the restroom, and noticed that our dog was sitting, just looking at the door that led out to the small hallway. On the other side was the main door to the house. I called for him to come back to bed, and he just put his nose at the base of the bedroom door, sniffing while scratching. Thinking he too had to use the restroom, I walked up to the main house door and opened it, ushering him to go do his business. He ended up just sitting there and staring. After trying to coax him to go outside a few times and failing, I closed the door and made my way to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. In the kitchen, there was a big window to the right of the sink, overlooking the driveway to the house, with a bit of light that makes the driveway just barely visible at night. As I reached to turn on the faucet, my head turned to the right to look outside, and I could see a dog sitting outside, staring into the house. Something was off about this dog, though. It was much larger than a typical large breed by 2 times. I began to get the chills and internally said to myself, "Screw this." Grabbing my water and about to head back to bed, the dog got up and began to walk away. It's hard to explain, but the way the dog walked was off. It seemed to walk very awkwardly and stiff. After making my way back to bed, I eventually managed to fall asleep. The next morning at breakfast, I nonchalantly asked if the neighbors had an extra large dog. That's when Grandma began to ask questions and my girlfriend started to look concerned. Her grandma immediately made a few phone calls, and after a bit of time passed, a native priest and healer arrived at the house, and they began conversing silently with Grandma. Thinking I must have done something wrong, my girlfriend joined them in their conversation. They all began to look at me and talk more, and then the priest went around the house with sage and cedar. The healer came to talk with me about my experience, and my girlfriend disappeared outside the house, apparently to gather raw meat. From what I understand, I encountered something I shouldn't have the previous night, and by my arrival, they had to make certain preparations to ensure our safety for the duration of my stay. After this visit, we visited many other times, and I didn't have any other weird experiences, but it left me chilled to the bone and will stay with me for the rest of my life. I can't get over how this dog behaved and how huge it was. Around a year ago, in May of 2020, my parents were going on their annual trip to Florida with my 3 brothers for the week. My mother asked me if I could go by their house and feed the family dogs or stay and house sit. Being the daughter I am, I told my mother I'd just stay at their house to save on gas. Throughout the week at night, I'd bring the 2 dogs inside to feel safer, since my parents live on somewhat of a back road. Keep in mind, my parents' house is surrounded by trees, and there's a thick tree line separating their house from the 2 neighbors. Well, one night while I was at the house alone, I called my best friend Bailey to come over and stay the night. We were going to do what 2 middle-aged 20-year-old females do when alone. Play video games, watch movies, TikToks, and drink a little. While Bailey and I were in the kitchen, around 3 or 4 a.m. making homemade funnel cakes, the dogs kept moving around and staring at the glass kitchen door that led off into the back porch. I asked Bailey to let them out so they could chill and we'd have enough leg room while we were cooking. While we were eating our funnel cakes, we came across a TikTok about making homemade temporary tattoos with a printed picture and perfume. Now, keep in mind, my parents have almost 4 acres of land, so there's the family house, my father's 2-door garage workshop, and a large barn. Those 2 buildings are farther out near the tree line, so Bailey and I walked down to the workshop to go into my parents' work office. I punched in the code to the garage door, and we went inside straight to the computer and printed each other out a picture of Kylo Ren to try and make into temporary tattoos for each other. Before I go any further, a little side note. My parents have security cameras all around their property, and inside the office is a television above the desk showing all of the live footage from the cameras. So while I was cutting out the tattoo for Bailey, she says, "What is that?" I stop cutting and look up at the cameras. At first, I didn't see anything except for a small figure in front of the pole barn. It looked like it was sniffing at the garage door. I shrugged it off and told her it was probably one of the many stray dogs that roamed around the area. Bailey nudged my arm quickly after I said that and pointed to the screen again. Wanting to prove to her it was just a stray dog, I stood up and looked closer at the screen. When I did, I saw the figure, but it didn't look like one of the small dogs. The creature was hunched over on all 4s. Its arms were super thin and long, but pointing outwards from its chest. Kind of like how you'd imagine the girl from The Exorcism to be when she crawled on all 4s. It had no fur. Its skin looked tight on its body. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I went to open the door to look at it. But thankfully, Bailey stopped me right when I grabbed the lock. Looking back at the screen at the creature, it looked like it scratched at the door of the pole barn. I immediately said, "What the hell is that?" And the creature turned its head straight at the camera. When its head turned, I couldn't make out clear facial features, but it looked like it had a human head with two big glowing eyes. Bailey and I screamed, and it bolted, and I mean bolted, off screen. Clearly freaked out, Bailey and I hugged each other as if that would protect us. Then something smashed against the garage door, not once, but twice. Like, you know what it sounds like when someone smacks the garage door from the outside with their hand? That's what it sounded like. I called my grandmother and told her we thought we saw something and to stay on the phone with us until we ran into the house. Once we got into the house, we brought the dogs in and locked every single door. Eventually, we were able to fall asleep. Now, we've talked about this a few times, and I think it was a wendigo, but Bailey thinks it was a skinwalker. Either way, I know I'll never go out to that building alone at night, ever again. My story starts with coming back from the store with my family. In my village, an entire new neighborhood was being built. Mind you, I live in an area that used to have a lot of forest around me, which has since been destroyed due to people building houses. There was a dirt road in the middle of the woods from the main road that led to a shortcut to my house. I was maybe 9 or 10 at the time, and I distinctly remember sitting in the middle seat in the middle row of our family minivan, so I had a clear view in between the driver's seat and passenger seat. I was talking with my younger siblings, goofing off, and I looked up to see it crouched on the road. It looked almost exactly like the picture you get when you Google the rake. It had pale gray skin. It was freakishly slender, and it had eyes like reflectors. I freaked out and screamed, saying something along the lines of, "What is that?" And both of my parents turned around, asking what I was talking about. I burst into tears and saw it run over behind a tree. It was so tall. I saw it peek from the tree a couple of times and explained what it looked like to my mom while hysterical. My mom didn't believe me at all and got mad at me for trying to scare my siblings. Around that time, I used to watch a lot of those ghosts caught on tape type stuff on YouTube, and I'd show my younger siblings, which resulted in many nightmares for them. My dad, on the other hand, said it was probably just a deer. It looked nothing like a deer. I still remember the eyes. When we passed by the tree I saw it run behind, nothing was there. It was completely dark. I thought I must have imagined it, until my dad told me he saw something too when we got home. He told me he had seen something out of the corner of his eye, but didn't get a good look since I started screaming and he had turned around to look at me. To this day, it still scares me, and I never walk too close to the woods at night.